Kevin McCullough.
Welcome back to Times Square. That Kevin Show. Glad you're with us. Have you gotten the swag? See, it's not a turban exactly, but it is how I come up with all of my political prognostications. It's my turban. ThatKevinStore.com if you want to get some of the swag, some of the gear. Inez Stetman is my guest, and she's been with us many times in the past, but glad to have her back. Inez, you've awakened us to the reality that in New York State, the voters here are going to, they've got to weigh in on this amendment to the state constitution, because it's going to override the legislature. It's going to override basically the will of the voters going forward. And that's why it needs to be dealt with now. Who is putting it forward? Do we know anything about the groups, the dark, shadowy groups that have put this legislation together?
Well, a lot of this comes from activist groups, right? In the same way, and I think in the last segment, you talked about my colleague Kelsey Bolar and her amazing work on putting forward some of these stories of women who have had men transfer into their prisons. In a lot of these issues, it's the ACLU, right? The New York ACLU. It's like trans activist groups. And so I don't have I don't know who's funding their side.
But there's no real opposition in Albany. So the idea that they're going to be able to get it across pretty quietly is pretty easy. That's the problem when you have one party in charge of everything, friends. That's the problem. You don't have a stopgap measure. There's no brake on the wheel. It's just hell's bells, hair on fire, here we go. And that's what they've done. So what is the Independent Women's Forum proposing in terms of what we do? Just get out the word and beat it at the poll? Is there some place that people can call, email, get more information on it? What's the call to action here?
Yeah, so this is going to be on your ballot, and really the call to action is just read this proposal and think about what the consequences of it are, because this is really one of those situations where we're not seeing a lot of advertising. We're not seeing we're just hoping basically, or the proponents of this proposal are just hoping that people don't read it very carefully, and that they sort of look just at the title of it or the top line or the first line, and they don't see the radical consequences of overriding parents' rights in schools, the putting boys in women's sports, right? And transferring men to women's prisons, the full recognition that there's no distinction between men and women, girls and boys under the law in New York State. And so it's really just a matter of informing people about the consequences, because I really believe that if voters read this carefully and if they understand the consequences of it, they will reject it, because it is radical. That's why they're not talking about the consequences. That's why we don't have a big blitz from, big Democrat money groups. I think they think the better strategy for them, and they might be right, is just not to talk about this and slip it through under the radar.
Like so many things in Albany, the dead of night is the approach, the strategy that they employ to win. Let me quickly shift to the presidential race just for a second. President Trump, I believe, is on record as saying that he will roll back the Biden administration's policies, kind of blackmailing public schools into accepting the gender identity agenda. Do we know where Kamala Harris stands on any of this? I mean, at least today, she may have changed it from where she stood yesterday, but what's on this policy issue specifically, is there a distinguishable difference between the two candidates?
Sure. Kamala Harris just went on The View and said that there's no daylight between her and the Biden administration. So, and she's been very participatory in the Biden administration's efforts to completely rewrite Title IX. Now, those efforts are on pause in about half the states because it's a huge overreach for a government agency, an executive agency like this, to redefine sex and to use Title IX to do something that's the exact opposite of the clear legislative.
Thank you for making that distinction.
So I don't know what the future of these regs are, regardless of the presidential election. I would hope that courts would strike it down as a clear overreach from the Biden administration. But in terms of the election, Kamala Harris endorses everything the Biden administration has done. She just told us yesterday that that's the case. So yes, there's an enormous difference. And actually, we at IW have launched a scorecard around this issue of men and women's sports specifically, but you can broaden it out to say basically the denial of sex differences and trying to push that idea into law. Because again, this is an issue where there isn't actually that much disagreement among the American people. It really is a small percentage of leftist activists who insist that we should be putting boys on girls track teams, right? And actually, the number of Americans who believe in those ideas is going down over time. In other words, there was a certain percentage of people who didn't want to seem mean, who wanted to be polite and nice and go along with this. But we're seeing, as the consequences are becoming clear to women and girls, Americans are going back the other way, right? This is a strong majority issue that goes well beyond the right.
Stick around for more of That Kevin. Next, That Kevin Show with Kevin McCullough.